welcome to another Midrash Rabbah 2.0 with Rabbi Q and After His Heart Ministries. And the question that I have for you today is, does it matter whether you know someone's name or not? That is my question. All that and more as we get into the next section of Torah, the second book of Torah, Shemot, or what has been inappropriately named by the Gentiles, Exodus. Okay, so couple things right off the bat. First one is, number one, this is not going to be the normal Midrash format. We're doing things a little bit different, and I will tell you that today has been kind of interesting in that I was really unable to broadcast this morning. I was having some mental turmoil and was feeling really kind of almost sick. And I thought about canceling completely, and something told me not to cancel completely. So I went ahead and I kind of gave my congregation a little bit of kind of like not necessarily an incentive, but basically something to do in the interim until we do get into the Midrash. And what I did is I said, what does it mean? What does the concept of a name mean? And I told them to post it in the Midrash section. And so we basically are going to be kind of reviewing that a little bit. And we are going to go ahead and do some recapping really quick. Okay? So, unique to this ministry is the discovery of the cycle of Israel. Now, I could tell you there's a variation of it out there. When I first heard the teaching, I heard it from somebody who was a layperson in the congregation that I was in when I was first starting to step into Torah in its depth. But what we discovered was that in this cycle of Israel, there was a connection to the cycles of the seasons, and therefore to the connection to the promise within the rainbow, etc., etc. And pretty soon we were off in some realm of possibility that we have actually been out of sync with creation and with God because of our lack of understanding of what could best be described as the Fibonacci sequence within nature, the golden ratio sequence within nature, the golden angle sequence within nature, the golden triangle, golden rectangle, however you want to look at it. Furthermore, we understood that sacred geometry actually plays a role in the cycle of Israel. So the cycle of Israel is real simple. We start at around springtime, and with springtime is the time of resurrection. Everything has been dead, right? And then we start to move into summer, and as we move into summer, things that were dead and are now growing up. Remember, Yeshua said something about the seed being dropped into the ground and then that becoming sprouts. Well, that particular area of season also corresponds with certain feast days. Well, in addition to corresponding with certain feast days, we have something interesting happening that as something becomes mature or it starts to become fat and sleek instead of being hungry and having a little bit of desperation, perhaps a strong dependence on the Creator, the light of the Creator. Instead, there starts to be a little bit of a persistence of some sort of belief in the ego that they produced the crops, that they grew the food, that they were the ones who had caused the field to grow. Yeshua brings up that idea that the seed dies and then it has to go into the ground and it dies and then it eventually resurrects. And of course, then there's the seed, the stalk, and then the head or the ear. The premise or the point behind this is basically that once that little bit of ego and self belief in self-production of the light or of the field enters through, or something enters through a portal that would normally be closed, and it's called infestation. And the way infestation works is simply that as people begin to disconnect from their soul and be more reliant on their ego, there is a context of that disconnection resulting in a philosophical change. And that philosophical change usually moves in the direction of maybe it's not the creator involved here. And then along comes something that says, hey, if you're interested, it seems like maybe you're a little disgruntled with your God, you should try our God. In fact, you know what's really cool is that we get to do all kinds of fun things. Like, for example, we can practice reproduction without responsibility. Or better yet, there's all these foods you can eat. That the foods that you're not allowed to eat, that your God says you're not allowed to eat, you can eat, right? Let's have a feast together. In fact, you know what you could do? You could do your feast style, and I'll do my feast style, and we'll get together and have a really good time. And what they don't know is that they were given instruction to completely stay separate from the culture and behavior of the nations. Do not learn their ways or learn about their culture. It is not part of your lifestyle. Well, within the cycle of Israel, then we move into the realm of oppression, where they say, oh, well, you know, kind of didn't mention it, but if you do worship our God, here's some rules. And just so you know, one of the rules is that you can't be Jewish anymore. You can't be in the commandments anymore. And oh, here's another thing. Yeah, so we really also kind of control you. But I mean, it's not like control. I mean, it's just kind of more like you got to follow some rules, and they're not the rules that I have to follow, but you do have to follow them yourself. So let's just go ahead and say that, you know, you have to worship our God, you have to do these things, and you can't really bring up that you don't like what we're doing. Okay, so that's kind of the oppression side, where they start kind of wearing away at your faith, at your Torah observance, at your belief in God, and start kind of adding in this idea that sooner or later we're going to arrive at, during the possession phase, human sacrifice of males, chattel slavery of males, sacrifice of females, very specifically virgins, so young females, exploitation of children, etc. And then there's also another element, which is basically kind of this concept of like a connection into darkness, right? Kind of a overcoming of guilt, kind of sighing away the moral compass, so to speak. So by the time we arrive at possession, it's usually declared that it's actually this demon that you need to worship, and you need to satisfy him by shedding some blood, and then the crops will grow, and then the rain will fall, and all of a sudden you're like, wait a minute, wait, that's what we were into in the beginning, right? Where I make the crops grow. Now you're saying this guy does it, but I thought that guy did it. And so now there's confusion, and there's a number of other things that come up. But what is the key is that once possession occurs, it triggers a crying out. And that crying out in that moment is actually a declaration that I don't want to serve this demonic force. I want to serve the King of Heaven. I want to serve the Creator. I want to be back in the light. And what is the first thing that happens is all of a sudden their identity is awoken, and they remember who they are as the people of Yahweh, And all of the sudden, they're able to deliver themselves by a strong, some sort of rallying of an army and a moving away from that area of compromise. But also within it is a supernatural enhancement. Look at Gideon, or look at Deborah. Look at all the different judges and see there's a supernatural enhancement of that deliverance. In other words, it becomes a co-authorship of deliverance. Now, here's something interesting about this. First of all, in my learnings in the past, there's been kind of a lot of different principles and models and other things that I've applied to my life long before I stepped into the title of teacher. And truly, that has been about really understanding how things have changed my life. So if I apply a model and it changes my life, I continue to use that model. Well, one of the models that I work with is that when you are given an opportunity to join the Creator in a work, not only are you enabled, empowered, given the authority, but it will be impossible without that empowerment and authority. What we would call maybe a God-sized task. In other words, there will be an element of it where if you are not in that connection with God after that crying out, they won't be able to deliver themselves, which means, interestingly enough, they step into this identity that's way beyond just human interaction and understanding. The next thing that happens is what we call obedience without free will. And what I mean by that is that basically you kind of enter into a contractual state in which it just simply says, if I enable you to deliver yourself, then you also need to step into basically a forced obedience to Torah. But then there will come a time when you will start to grow out of that. We call that, interestingly enough, the time of death. And why? Because now it is kind of like almost an automaton state. It is a state in which there's kind of an obligatory Torah. Now, the intensification of all power in the universe does not want to leave us in this state because we cannot actually receive the light without free will. And so what's interesting is that that implied state of obedience begins obligatory in the sense of, I will deliver you if you do this, right? But what we don't realize is built into that whole mechanism is the merit of the Yeshua principle, which I'll get into in a minute. But the concept is that basically, as much as it seems like you don't have free will, there's actually a concept that you are tapping into a free will, but you have this kind of this fear of being disobedient at that time. Well, and of course, as we move into the resurrection phase or the life phase in which all of a sudden the sprouts begin to come up, there's a movement back into that state there's a movement back into that state. Now, the whole concept or idea is that after a war and after a deliverance, the place is left in just completely diminished quality. And so it's almost as if the land is under a curse. And so as you move out of that deliverance stage, out of that stage in which possession is eliminated through a change in identity, and that change in identity is about a connection in which now Yahweh's going to have you name the animals, so to speak. From that movement onward, when you go into that kind of that state of obligatory obedience, really technically what it is you do not feel comfortable being disobedient when you just received deliverance. It's a clear conscience, yes, but there's also a discomfort in the fact that God had to do the work, and you didn't really get to do the work. And so there's a point in time where your identity starts to change a little bit, and you start to realize, I need to do the work. And so you start doing shadow work, you start doing personality work, you start using certain modeling techniques to really kind of change how you think about things and all that. And that obligatory feeling starts to dial away, and you all of a sudden have the free will again, which you really never lost, but that's just kind of how your mind works. Once Israel realized they were sovereign again, the cycle begins again. So the sovereignty falls to springtime, okay? But the maturity falls to summertime, and the falling away or the entropy of that situation happens in the fall. At a time when the fall feast should be activated, people are starting to move into a state of compromise, and there's infestation. So there's a couple of things that are important. First one is that obviously what we need to do then is we need to establish some very, very imperative ground rules, okay? So ground rule number one is, when we read this particular parasha, we hear God say that Pharaoh is going to harden his heart. And then we hear that God is going to harden Pharaoh's heart. Okay? Now, in that process, there is a concept that if that be true, we can accept that it begins with the choice, right? Okay. So again, we're back at free will, and we're not stuck in this hyper-deterministic doctrinal error of saying that God created Pharaoh to fall and die so that his name would be known. That is hogwash. That is actually accusing God of having emotional deficits, accusing God of being some sort of petty and frivolous type of a God, that accuses him of being malevolent and therefore a trickster. So what we're going to do here is, whether you like it or not, and you can stop the video and go away and never come back, or you can listen and adjust your brain. And that is, God will not raise somebody up to perish, but will operate within the personality and the dynamics of that human being in context of what they choose to do. In other words, it did not necessarily have to go down this way in the book of Exodus. It did not have to happen this way, but it did. And we can accept that. But the most important thing to realize is this whole concept of that God allowed his special, chosen, covenanted through Abraham's loins people to just fall into suffering so he could be glorified. That's an accusation. And I'm going to tell you right now, that accusation comes from a lack of belief and understanding. Let me explain. It's a lack of belief that God is benevolent only. And it is lack of understanding that he does not suffer from your emotional deficits. When we talk about giving him glory, and when he needs the credit, or he's going to throw this big old fit, do you have any idea what level of disconnect occurs with an intellectual mind who's deep into the sciences when they hear that Sky Daddy gets mad if he doesn't get the credit? Do you really want to serve a God like that? No, you do not. And so here's the amazing thing about it. Those people were in oppression due to idolatry. They went through the cycle. They went through the cycle of infestation, the cycle of oppression, the cycle of possession. They cried out to God because they realized their identity was not intact and they could not deliver themselves. That's the first action. It's this humility. Humble yourself in the sight of the Lord. right? Humble yourself in the sight of the Lord. Resist the devil and he will flee from you. The concept of getting low and then all of a sudden you start to have to experience this resistance to that demonic force that wants child sacrifice, that wants, phallic symbols set up in your home, that wants, household gods, the saints, whatever. And also just this general concept of doing something human to somehow satiate a god is just asinine. Think about this. If your creator, whom you believe in, because if you're on this channel and you're an atheist, I love you. I really do. You got guts to be here, because I'm telling you, this requires you to believe in something, right? But just say for an instance that really you're kind of at the agnostic level and you're like, something's there. We definitely have intelligence design. We definitely have, the things that would indicate something greater. Do you really want that entity to be so sissy la that number one, you got to satisfy him by shedding blood? How petty, how lame, how ridiculous. Now, if you want to understand this better, there's actually a series on this YouTube channel called How to Satiate a God. I think it's a 3-part series, about 45 minutes apiece. You'll get through it. That teaches you that there's no such thing as a sacrifice within the ancient Hebrew lifestyle and thought process. There's slaughtering and proper slaughtering, and there's table fellowship, but there's no satiating bloodletting. That's so ridiculous. And it is so nations. It is so goyim. It is so not covenanted people with the intensification of all power and the answer. I'm going to make it real simple for you. If you think that you somehow have to satiate your God with anything, including a substitutionary sacrifice, you probably need to think about how much bigger you could get with that God. How much less petty you could get. You know how much we drag God out of heaven with our minds thinking that we need to somehow satiate some pettiness? It's all hogwash. It's all hogwash. Stop thinking that way. Stop acting that way. Stop believing that way. Stop living your lifestyle that way. What really needs to happen here, and this is important, is we need to start to come into an understanding of equality connection with the intensification of all power in the universe and what that would require for your identity, what that would require for the other things in your life. So I know that we're going a little bit long with the recap here, but I want you to understand that God did not just let his people go into slavery and suffering with Pharaoh. In fact, I can probably prove to you through the Hebrew and through a couple extra biblical texts that they were actually in military indentured service as a result of the things that happened with Joseph when people were buying food. Now, the short version of this is that there's a point in time when the bad to the bone elite guerrilla guard of Jacob's family, the ones who were able to kill so many people in Shechem, right? And all the other battles that we have later on, and the military elitism is indicative that Pharaoh wanted that ninja service, okay? And so he figured out a way to get them to do it. Now, the bricks and the straw and all that stuff, you know what? Do you really think there was an apple in the garden? Somewhere along the lines, we're going to have to accept that there might be an allegorical element to the story. But so what? What if they were just chattel slavery? They were just cattle. What if they were just owned? He would not allow it without them stepping into the maturity phase and not responding correctly to their egos who said, we grew these crops. You see, it says Jeshurun grew fat and sleek and kit, right? Like, nope, I ain't pulling this plow anymore. I own this field, right? That's the concept. So it is absolutely imperative that A, whatever it is that created you, be the biggest and baddest dude out of the whole group. B, that he's not that frivolous that he's just going to throw you under the bus. C, that he's not so sovereign and such a jerk that he's going to create somebody to just be destroyed, or worse yet, let his covenant people suffer. How absolutely ridiculous, especially when Deuteronomy 28, 1 through 14 says, if you keep my commandments, right? What commandments? The commandments that were written upon your heart from the foundations of the earth, because Yeshua was slain from the foundations of the earth, and this is what it says, if a Gentile, though not having the law, does the things of the law, they show themselves to be a law unto themselves, meaning what? There's a sovereignty to their choice to be obedient to something that doesn't make any sense, except that it's on their heart. Their conscience excusing or defending them in the day of judgment, which is Yom Kippur. Now we find Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and other people in the pre-patriarch period honoring certain feast day requirements and moving in a Torah that was not written. So Deuteronomy 28 says, 1 through 14 says, if you keep my commandments, you do these things, all these blessings will follow you. But if you don't keep my commandments, verse 15, all these things will happen. And then it goes all the way to verse 68. That's a lot of curses. Go all the way to verse 68 if you don't do it. And so when we look at the oppression of Pharaoh over the people, you need to stop thinking that that's just was some sovereign move from God. If you think that, you're accusing God of being a jerk. Why is this so important? Because when you start to put things into perspective, they make more sense. Israel as a nation needed a judge because they had sold themselves to idolatry. And that idolatry had resulted in eventual shedding of blood of innocence in order to compensate for the problem. Book of Yashar, I believe it is, says that Pharaoh was using the blood of Hebrew children to cure his diseases, including the boils. So in principle, then, we can accept that this oppression over these people was a result of an identity problem, which was the result of a compromise, which was the result of an infestation. And that is the rest of the story. So when we come into Exodus, and we come into Jacob and these people coming down, these 70 nations, as it were, coming down into Egypt, and Joseph dying, and a new king, Pharaoh, whatever the name would be, is raised up, then we have a better understanding of why. You see, this cycle promises this to the covenanted people, that if they forget their God, I'm going to tell you right now, it is not a hungry people that forget their God. It's a full belly that forgets your God. If you do not respond correctly to the things that would keep you in a state of connection. You need to understand, when we come into the story, we have missed the idolatry. We have missed the oppression. We have missed the infestation. We are in the possession stage and the crying out stage and the Yeshua activation stage. You say, what's the Yeshua activation stage? Told you I'd get to that. Let's say that a wolf comes into a group of sheep and grabs a sheep and starts to head away with it. That sheep bleats, cries out. The shepherd goes, oh, somebody's being taken. And they don't take their shepherd's staff. They take this big old honking club looking thing, or it might be a chopping weapon, which is basically blades inside a bone designed to completely cut through bone. And they go find the wolf, bash him over the head, take the sheep away. That's Yeshua. The name Yeshua means to violently snatch out of danger. But the parent root is actually destroyer watches. He's watching to destroy that predatory animal, right? Okay, so he's waiting for you to cry out. You cry out, and now all of a sudden a deliverer is sent to change your identity so that you can walk out of that possession as an army, as a warrior, as one prepared for battle, which is exactly what happens. 610 people, sorry about going forward into the parashas, 610 men, military armed men on foot, leave Egypt. Boy, that's an elite force to just be sitting there taking one for the team and putting blocks on top of a pyramid. I ain't buying it. So in principle, the context would be, now we understand, we join Shemot. We join the first parasha in Exodus after the crying out. The Yeshua principle has begun. Okay? So what did we miss? We missed the resurrection period. We missed the maturity. We missed the oppression. We missed the infestation. We missed the fatness that they probably enjoyed. I mean, come on, think about this. Jacob goes down to goes down to Egypt, and Pharaoh's like, all right, number one, y'all don't have to pay nothing for the food. Number two, you don't have to do anything for me. But if you did happen to have somebody who was really good at their job, I do got some livestock they could look after. Furthermore, you also get to live in the best of the land, which was considered to be Goshen. That's fatness. That is not hunger. That is not famine. And so what we know is that there had to have been some sort of shift in that policy, that Jacob and his offspring would not be allowed to continue in their fatness, but would have to move in another direction, which is what? Indicative of oppression, which is followed by what? Infestation, which means somebody worshipped a false god, which Deuteronomy chapter 32 verses 15 says is demons. Shadim. Meaning what? They started to worship demons, and now all of a sudden there's oppression, and now there's rules, and the policy changes, and Joseph's dead, and who cares about this Jacob? Put him to work, right? And obligate them into this indentured service, which appears to be, because Pithom and Ramses were chariot cities, which appears to be a military exercise. Now, this whole thing about bricks and straw, again, you need to be careful with. But the premise is, in short, whether they were actually a military service to Pharaoh or they were actually building the pyramids, like there's no evidence that anybody in a state of indentured slavery built the pyramids. There's no reference to them doing that. And so we make assumptions with that. But here's the part that's important in this context, and that is that we're joining them at the Yeshua stage. We're joining them at the Messiah stage. We're joining them at the deliverer leadership, one leader raised up to lead the army out of possession. Gideon. Deborah, Samson, Jehu, all of those judges. I used to be able to name all of them. All of those judges were deliverer, leadership style people to have Israel awaken from their stupor of their identity. So now you understand why I had to give that long old thing, because we're coming into a very confusing set of circumstances that, if not understood correctly within the ancient Hebrew nomadic policy of lifestyle, could be misconstrued as a malevolent God. In fact, I've had dark people ask me, if you believe in Sky Daddy, why would he let his people go into Egypt to begin with? You celebrate the Passover, but you never register. Why would he do that to a people? They were desperate. They were going in because of a famine. They were blessed and favored by Pharaoh. What's the big deal? Why all of a sudden is there this change in attitude from God, from favor to darkness, from favor to disfavor, from abundance to severe lack and decrease? Duh. Torah and a violation thereof, Deuteronomy 28. Moses, I call heaven and earth as witness against you, that today I have set before you life and death, a blessing and a curse. Choose life that you might live. So, that's all I need to say about that. The next thing that we necessarily need to get into before I start to get into some of the discussions that have been going on in the Midrash channel, which are very intriguing, is the concept and principle of the name, the proper name or title of Exodus, which is Shemot. Shemot, interestingly enough, is translated inappropriately, but we can ballpark it by calling it names. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. But truth be told is that's a horrible translation, and I will just remind you, when I teach English as a second language to a group of people who do not speak English, one of the things I teach them right off the bat is my alphabet is not your alphabet. My grammatical philosophy is not your grammatical philosophy. My accent is not your accent. See, I teach people who speak Hindu how to properly pronounce English to work in a call center and not be misunderstood. In that, there's something you need to realize. My language is not your language. Hebrew is not English, and it can't be translated. We can ballpark it, we can get it close, but there's a different philosophy, there's a different lifestyle, there's a different mysticism behind Hebrew that is not present in the American Protestant Christian's mouth of English. So Shemot is a good example of this, because really, truly, what Shemot means, what does Shem mean? Does it mean name? We call, if you are Hasidic or ultra-Orthodox Jewish, you would call Yahweh Hashem, the name. So instantaneously, our little English Anglo-Saxon brains are tweaked by the concept of what we understand a name to be. What is crazy is that it is actually an identity. And the actual name of this portion is identities. And we need to start looking at identities as we understand the dynamics of everything that has gone on. So, having said that, I feel like that's a pretty good introduction into the parasha Shemot. And I know that I didn't do an introduction to Breshit, and I know that there's a lot of things that we should probably get into with this parasha. But if you were to turn off the video right now, you have received enough information to go back and alter your lifestyle as a result of having read the first first 5 chapters and first verse of Exodus. And as a Protestant Christian, you need to re-examine your lifestyle and your attitude towards things, because one of the things I'll remind you of is, number one, hindsight is not 2020 when it comes to Torah. These people were living their lives. These people were doing the best that they could do with what they had to work with. And they didn't have the luxury of reading the rest of the story like we do. And so we can go read to the Red Sea, but truth be told, I want you to think about when they did not know about a Red Sea. If you didn't know about a Red Sea and you only read this chapter, how horrible things have become for the covenant people of Yahweh. Okay, so in principle then, let's see if we can just jump into this a little bit. And I will tell you, I have Zohara here. She's going to stay off of camera today. But we are definitely going to go ahead and look into the Midrash itself. Now, some of these were actually kind of comments more than they were discussion questions. But I think that it is very important that we kind of get the depth of this, right? So in principle, what we have here is basically a question. These aren't really questions here. So I'm hesitant to read the statements because I don't know whether or not people want me to just broadcast the whole statement. But let's see if we can look at this from that perspective and see if I can't back these up a little bit. So we've already kind of talked about names and identities. That's a given. So we don't necessarily need to hit on that first paragraph in the Midrash channel for those of you who are in the congregation and watching and have read in the Midrash channel. But the second one's probably important. I'm going to go ahead and see if I can kind of so the concept, I'm just going to see if I can reiterate this without actually saying it for word. The concept within this parasha that's pretty powerful is the fact that they, and I didn't really bring this up in the cycle of Israel recap, but one of the things that you need to think about, and is mentioned here in this paragraph that's written, is that there had to be a forgetting of identity. And it's interesting because when Israel comes out of their oppression, possession, comes out of the other nation being in control of them, the identity isn't fully realized until they step back into that morality of, instead of being obedient because they're going to be punished, or being obedient because they'll be liked, but being obedient because they have the free will to do so. Choosing good for the sake of good, not for the sake of the consequence or the opinion of others. I think that's pretty powerful. But yeah, I agree with this particular paragraph that kind of indicates that, yeah, so they actually did forget their identity. And it's interesting because you don't really even see Jacob being in his identity when he starts this interaction returning into Joseph's life and moving down to Egypt. And so I think that is definitely an important point to bring up. And I think one of the things I do want to quote out here is this happens when life becomes unmeasured, when labor has no rhythm, and when memories are erased. So the premise is that it definitely has to do with a maintenance on rhythm. And we can definitely get into that. I mean, one of the first things that ends up on the chopping block in the transition from the Way, which was a Jewish sect, to Christianity, which was a foundational derogatory term used to describe the people who were of the Way, and eventually became the reference to them sufficient enough that when the Treaty of Milan in 321 AD was activated and they were given rights, that's the title that they actually kind of took. In that transition, by 325 AD, the feast days were on the chopping block. The actual commanded feasts of God versus the established, for lack of better words, pagan feasts of the land. So yes, there is always kind of a forgetting of identity and a moving away from a state of a state of solidarity in faith. Okay, so the relevance is going to come in the actual concept that part of oppression will be a removing of your faith tenets, a wearing down. In fact, when we look at the various attacks of the enemy, there is an attack that is subtle and is supposed to just kind of look like life circumstances. A punch, but not a hard one. And you're like, oh yeah, that hit my pocketbook. Oh yeah, that hit my, that hit my psychological bank account. Oh yeah, that was hard, but it's just life. And then there is a realization from those who are being infested by this that it's not just life, and we are not the ones who cause the crops to grow. Do we cultivate them? Do we plant the seed? Absolutely. But we are very dependent on it, right? Okay, I will add that, Paul. Okay. So the premise is that in that context, there's this idea of this subtlety that doesn't appear to actually be a spiritual attack. And then there is what we call the deal, or not the deal, the sucker punch, the haymaker, we call it, where basically we say, oh, you know what? That actually is an attack from the enemy. That is a spiritual damage to my life as a result of the darkness that's involved in it all. And it says, oh, since you know who it is, boom, and just square, right? So what's interesting is if you respond to the boom with that same attitude of, aha, that's the enemy, then the next one is really interesting because that is the actual wearing down. Now, what's intriguing about this is there's almost kind of an opposite effect that occurs with the infestation, oppression, possession. Infestation, let's wear down your morals. Let's wear down and make you have compromises. You don't really even realize that it is the enemy. You just think that maybe it's a little bit more creature comforts. Yeah, these people don't worry so much about what they eat. these people don't worry so much about what day the Sabbath falls on. So we should kind of align with them, right? Whereas the rabbis are throwing a fit, rolling over in their grave saying that's assimilation. And truth be told, is there is a mentioning about assimilation in these paragraphs today. So point being is that she made a point about the frog being boiled in the water, doesn't realize that it's dying, that it's being boiled, right? And so the premise is that it's that same principle, that there's not an actual realization of how bad this choice actually is, right? Until we're in the state of possession, which of course I would say contextually would be the haymaker. Oh, you figured out it's me? Okay, cool. Then do what I say, right? That's kind of what Pharaoh did in these chapters. He's like, hey, you know what? I don't know what's going on here, but it's time to just make it known. Y'all are slaves. We're not going to let you multiply and be big. We're going to kill you. We're going to genocide you, right? Okay. So, so there's more mention in these parasha, or in this Midrash discussion about the loss of identity than anything else, and I think that's very important that we realize that that's true. I mean, I'm going to explain to you why. Okay. We know that Ezra, having ended up in the Bible, meant that his lifestyle choices were sufficient enough that Yahweh wanted to use his way of doing things as a model. Well, in the actual history, Ezra's the one who broke up the Torah into its portions, and specifically so that it could be read for 6 days in the marketplace, and on the seventh it could be discussed in the synagogue. And what's interesting is that at that time was the village, or I mean the city square, right? It says that there were things being read in the marketplace, and that those particular things that were being read were the parasha section. So he divided it up, right? Well, what's interesting is that he began the reading of the Torah portion at the end of the Feast of Tabernacles. And so as a result of that, that's what we do. We actually roll the scroll back, and we start that Bereshit is the next Shabbat after the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, what's interesting about this is in that then there's almost a guarantee that the book of Shemot will fall pretty close to right smack dab in the middle of the sowing season. Now, there's a few things that I think are pretty important about that. We get a taste of the Passover before the Passover, but what's interesting is the book ending of the light of Passover. But furthermore, there's another element here, which is that basically during the time when your identity is at stake, let me explain, it's definitely being Paul said that Torah was not written for those who were there, and that makes sense. They're not there to experience the Bible. They're living their lives, but it was written for us because there was modeling. Well, what's significant is that modeling places this portion right in the middle of the wilderness season, or I'm sorry, the sowing season. And the sowing season is not the reaping season. And the sowing season is not the feast day season. The sowing season is in between the two feast days. Sukkot, Feast of Tabernacles, and Passover. Now, what's interesting about that is during the sowing season, the enemy is accusing you of your past in order for you to confess your future so that you will begin to make the adjustments for it now, and that past is not your current identity. No one, and I don't care how out of this, how out of reality you are with this current time and understanding, you're not who you were a year ago. I don't care how messed up you might be right now, you're not as messed up as you were last year. You've gotten better. Because number one, that's what we want to do. See, that's one thing that I cannot stand about Christianity. They sit there and they say, oh, yeah, you actually cannot change. You have this sinful nature within you, and that sinful nature within you just consequently, just so you know, has pretty much, you're done for. And the only choice you have is to come to Christ, otherwise you're going to hell. No, we want to improve. Even if we're a thief, we want to improve how we thieve. Our minds are geared towards adaptation that is most beneficial to our circumstances, which means if we are good and we have a philosophy of good and we have a proactive approach that is good, we will improve, which means you're doing better than you were last year. What's my point? Well, my point has a number of things behind it, but basically the idea is that this is what is designed. The attack that's designed for this time period is to get you to tweak your identity back to a past state. Now, there's a number of ways in which that occurs, right? But the point is this is the identity phase, okay? So we don't want to get too much into it. There's plenty of teachings I've done in the past. You can go down and look through them. I think there's probably a video that might be good. It's called One Bad Apple. But there's a number of other videos that really nail this home. You can go watch the Renewing Your Mind series that consequently isn't complete, but there's a sufficient enough there for you to identify that something's wrong and some solutions for it. But the concept, and this is important, is that what is going on is the guilt that is not resolved as a result of a clear conscience that has to come from a meritless state is still present, and therefore that becomes the accusation to get you to confess that that's what you are, because once you say it, then you do it, so to speak. But the concept is also that when you confess that, you're also confessing it into the future as to what you will become. So the sowing season, interestingly enough, is to get you to sow bad seed from the past so that it becomes the future crop. And then during Passover, all the way to Shavuot, all the way to Pentecost, you reap that junk. And I can tell you, it turns kind of nasty. It does. It's been a rough year for his After His Heart Ministries because I didn't really pay attention to those teachings last year. But truth be told is that in that process, I've also learned this mechanism. Which means what? What do we need to do? A, we need to change that thought process concerning the past. What's the intrigue? The intrigue is what we try to do is repeat the past but take control of it differently. When the truth is that's not what we need to be doing during the sowing season. We need to be sowing new seed. So I could see how identity plays a huge role in this parasha that just happens to always fall around this time. And so I think, and it might be a little bit earlier in this season, because, sometimes Sukkot falls between September and October. Sometimes it's a little bit later into October. But the parasha Shemot is going to fall somewhere along this area. Here's a little bit of intrigue. What is the name of this month in the calendar that is not designed by Yahweh? It is named after the god Janus, who wants you to look into your past and into your future and use your past to command your future and create New Year's resolutions. That's right. The very existence of the name January as a month corresponds to the identity issue within the sowing season within this particular area of parashas. Oh, if we could really understand the bigger picture. Yeah, so I think forgetting who we are is really a good point that's made here. So then here is a question. It says, what are all the things that Torah provides for us to keep us in a cycle of remembrance? And certainly Sabbath, our feasts, and the reading of Torah, all of that reminds us of who we are. And then so we'll stick with that question. All right, so here we go. This is going to somewhat ride the curtails of the cycles teaching, which if you haven't watched that yet, I would highly recommend that you go and start with cycles number 1 and just work your way through. It was almost a year-long teaching, and I could tell you that it required a whole lot of study and a whole lot of learning. But the point behind it is simple, that there is a cyclical process to everything in the universe, and there's proof within the Bible itself that there's a cyclical process within the mechanism of the intensification of all power in the universe, and therefore it is most likely that there is a cycle within everything that if we were to fall into that cycle correctly, we would be in a more healthy state, a more spiritual state. We would have a higher authority, a higher ability or power, and we would be more connected into the corporate collective consciousness of benevolence. Anyways, in Genesis chapter 1 verse 14, I believe it is, it says, let them be for signs and for seasons and for years and for days. Now, when we look at the 1 year cycle when it comes to the parasha, we are looking at the feast days, right? We're looking at that Passover, Pentecost, Tabernacles cycle, okay? Which happens to also be contained within that cycle is the cycle of the flood. And also contained within that cycle is the cycle of Omer and the golden calf. Within that cycle of Omer, there are actually weeks of manifest power and manifest authority based upon the attributes of Yahweh. Within that cycle, there is a counting of Shabbats. Within that cycle is a reading of Torah portions. It's all there. And she says, yes, it does make sense that it would be the Sabbath, our feast, the reading of the Torah, and all that reminds us of who we are. But there's another cycle within all of this. Sure, we talk about feast days, let them be for days, right? Let the signs in the heavens, or let the things in the heavens, the luminaries, the sun, the moon, and the stars be for days, before years, before Moedim, appointed times. But there's another one that's really powerful, and that is let him be for the otiot. And the otiot are signs. Now, contextually, we can accept that some of that has to do with the ancient pictographic Hebrew alphabet. But I'm going to propose to you that that word signs is used in other places to indicate miraculous events. Otio comes out in such a way that it's very esoteric and it is very mystical. So it is not just physical realm here. So to answer your question, not only is it the feast days, the Sabbath, the Torah readings, yes, those are real, those are legit, those are definitely reminders, but you know what? I've gone through in the first few years of my Torah walk, I've gone through, this would be almost a good 20 years ago, I've gone through entire portions on autopilot. I've gone through entire portions without my conscience being clear. I've studied things, discovered things in Torah, and was having a horrible connection with the divine at that time. Now, were they high level, higher self revelations? Of course not. You got to be connected for that, right? But they were little insights. They were little things here and there. What's my point? My point is Torah's not enough to remind you. The feast days are not enough to remind you. I've gone through feast days either A, so miserable I didn't want to do it, or B, on autopilot. I've gone through feast days without a clear conscience. So no, that doesn't necessarily equate to the reminder either. The days, Sabbath. I will tell you, in my circumstances, it is difficult to go through Sabbath without being connected because A, I'm leading a congregation, and unless I've declared that we're not having services that week, it doesn't matter what state I'm in, the show must go on. And that's the beauty of that co-authorship. I step up to the camera, all of a sudden my headache's gone, my snivel's gone, and deep revelation is coming. It is just how it is. So in that way, I would say there is an element of reminder within the day of the Shabbat, but truth is you could do that too. I mean, how many people know the candle lighting by heart, know Lecha Dodi by heart, and say it every Shabbat? They go into the synagogue, they open their book, they say the thing, and that's all that it is. When Shabbat is practically the wedding ring of the joining between Yahweh and his bride, between the first vessel and the spirit, or the essence, I should say, of benevolence. And so I think it is important contextually then to find the truth, and that is disconnection is what causes us to forget. Those little moments where we get mad at God or we get mad at Torah and we start to disassociate from it sufficient enough that we either go through the motions on autopilot, which usually results in a car accident because you run a red light, or we somehow end up in a state of rebellion and begin to try to activate Torah through a form of witchcraft. Now, the intrigue here is in the idea that, in truth, all that's wrong here is the belief about self. You ask a Christian, what is the most important thing that you can do? They default to the greatest commandment. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. And then they, without a breath, quote the second. And love your neighbor as yourself. I always try to love my neighbor, even the one who's always calling the police on me. I always love God. This coming from the man who's on his third wife now and possibly going to have a fourth wife. This coming from a man who has nothing left because he's lost it all as a result of really, really bad behavior. That's the guy that's trying to love the Lord your God. Now, I'm not trying to be judgmental here. What I'm trying to say is that Christians say it without even realizing that they're saying it. They say, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. Second, like unto it, love your neighbor as yourself. And they miss that last word. They miss self. Truth be told, the maintenance of identity is within self-care. It is within the mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual self-care of a human being that the capacity to love your neighbor as yourself is even present. Because if you don't love yourself, you're in a state of self-loathing, you're carrying guilt, and you don't have a clear conscience, or any of the other hogwash that is all just lies. Because in the end, he made him who knew no sin to become sin for us. We might become the righteousness of God. Your position was never merited to begin with. And truth be told, if you are in covenant with Yahweh, it is not a matter of whether he sought you or you sought him or all the other weird Christian distractions of doctrine. It's that you're in covenant with him, which means it's not merited. You're in that position. But here's the crazy part about it. Ultimately, that means that Yeshua actually created a space by which the entire world could stop carrying a guilty conscience. In fact, I will tell you guys a little secret here. I will tell you that as I began my journey in all of this, in my anger and disappointment at the mainstream Christian doctrine being so off the wall from the Bible that it wasn't even funny, I abandoned Christianity. I said, yeah, I'm done with this. And I looked all over the place for a religion that fit. And what was interesting is, in the end, I discovered something that I didn't even realize that I had, that actually was the crux of why I was a Christian, and that was the ability to have a clear conscience. No other faith offers this. They offer disassociations, they offer satiations, they offer penance, they offer transcendence, but nothing actually offers an absolute clear conscience because your position was never merited to begin with. Okay, so in principle then, the answer to the question about reminding definitely does have to do with rhythm. That is definitely true and present within a lot of my teachings. The cycles teachings are about rhythm. The original cycle of Israel, the cycle of his people teaching, which is, I think, is right before, like maybe in the videos is either before or a little bit after How to Satiate a God, so you can go watch that too. But the cycle of his people basically is a concept of a rhythm, right? Because what you don't know is there's another cycle if they choose not to go after other gods. There's an abundance cycle, and that's a really cool teaching. That's in there somewhere too. So when we are working with this model of remembrance, the answer to your question is yes, Sabbath is great, feast days are great, and we could even lean in the direction of intention, but truth be told is it has to do with maintenance, right? It has to do with making sure that you stay connected in and you stay meritless. Once you start getting into merit, and I just discussed this with somebody the other day, but it was at the beginning of my Torah walk that I learned it. And it's powerful because I've taught it to this congregation and forgotten it and then remembered it again. You can't base your philosophical choices upon whether you're good or evil, or you're stuck in the realm of death, which means you will never move into abundance and you will stay within lack and decrease. You'll stay just under the quota of necessity. But when you begin to establish that you're just positioned and you need to get over it and everybody else needs to get over it, that you're just positioned as the righteousness of God, then you're operating in the realm of life, which is where abundance can occur. Because righteousness requires abundance. Did you know that if you actually don't have abundance, you're not walking in righteousness? Why? Because righteousness is not right living, not moral integrity. Righteousness is equal distribution of wealth. For lack of better words, socialism. But the premise, and this is an important one, is that there needs to be a change of paradigm. And this is the season for it. And this is the Torah portion for it. A change in paradigm. We're not slaves. We're a military elite group. Oops, we're not quite there yet because we need some miraculous stuff to occur in order for Pharaoh to be reminded that we are the people of Yahweh, not of the serpent. Egypt is the land of the serpent. The king of Egypt is the serpent. So this is an important concept because now we understand that identity is tied into maintenance. We are high maintenance children of God. What does that mean? Does that mean that we are like, California Beach Barbie and we need all kinds of accessories? No, that's not quite what that means. What that means is that he's going to be very diligent with the clipboard to go check and make sure the boiler's at the right pressure. That's right, building maintenance, right? He's going to make sure that the chlorine in the pool is at the right pH. That kind of maintenance. We are high maintenance, as in he checks and makes sure our condition is in a good state. Often, children of God. High maintenance, adopted children of God. I like to add adoption in there because there's a lot of people who have a real problem with the idea that they're children of God if they're not bloodline Israel. Yeah, no product. That's right. Okay, so all right, so then the next question on here, I think I'm actually gonna look at taking a break here pretty soon, and then we'll jump back into it and do a part 2 of the broadcast, because I feel like the Rabbi's nugget is this first part, because it's interesting, as I sat there today and I thought about the ramifications of this parasha, I said, and I can't just let this go into a discussion about whether we have straw or not and things like that. This needs to be deeper in understanding that we are joining the story at a certain point in the cycle, which means there are certain attributes of the cycle present that are not mentioned in the story. They are in a state of demonic possession where the demon over Egypt is in ownership of Israel from a standpoint of an inability for them to honor Torah, honor Yahweh, and operate within the meritlessness of election, which we don't necessarily need to get into. But the premise is that they were chosen and therefore they are protected unless they choose to remove that protection themselves. Okay? All right. So, I don't know if I'm the only one, but did anybody realize that Moses' life is broken down into 40-year increments? Yes, and let's just touch on that briefly. What is the number 40? whether it be a 40-day fast, whether it be Yeshua's fast, whether it be Moses on the mountain, whether it be Elijah's fast, whether it be the 40 days and 40 nights of the flood, whether it be the 40 years in the wilderness. What is the number 40? What is the intrigue of the number 40?
Well, you're missing one. The 40 days, and then Yeshua ascended.
Yeah, the 40 days and Yeshua ascended as well. Do you have anything to comment beyond that?
No.
Okay. So, in principle, the number 40 is a transition between heaven and earth. So, the earth went through a transition of heavenliness versus physicality in the flood. Okay? Yeshua goes between heaven and earth in his ascension. He goes between heaven and earth during his fast. Elijah passes between heaven and earth in his 40 days, where he's at the tree ready to die, says, I am no better than my fathers, let me join them. And the angel shows up and says, arise and eat. And he eats and then goes back to sleep. And he says, arise and eat. And he eats and goes back to sleep. Rise and eat, eats and goes back to sleep. And then he says, all right, go to Mount Horeb, which takes 40 days. And so he's 40 days without food and water. It says he went on the strength of that food and water for 40 days. Okay. And then Moses being on the mountain in these increments of 40 days and 40 nights. And then, of course, yes, there is a concept that when he's 40, this happens. When he's 80, this happens. When he is this age, this happens. And so, yes, there is definitely a connection between the number 40. But number 40 is the transition between heaven and earth, a transcendence that can be both up and down. You could probably even potentially look at the context of Jacob's ladder in that. What did Joseph and Moses have in common? So I told this person that if they wanted to, they could comment in the comment section for YouTube and explain what they thought it was. I can definitely do that, of course, as well. And of course, it's real simple. Both of them are kind of a type of Messiah. They are, well, I'll just put it to you simple enough. They are Messiahs, okay? Because there's more than one Messiah. And the concept is that you can be a Messiah. The key to everything in simplicity is that you are anointed for a purpose. That's a Messiah. The word Mashiach comes from the root mashach, which comes from the root mash, which is a parent root meaning to smear water or to spread water or to press water. And so that's the, or water presses. And when there was an anointing, there was a smearing of oil into the skin that occurred. Okay, a good book to read about that is called the Healing Oils of the Bible. Okay, so what else did Joseph and Moses have in common? Well, I would say one of them is definitely that both of them went into some sort of exile from their people. Both of them experienced a level of revelation with the intensification of all power in the universe that was different from the people around them. Both of them were called into a leadership position through circumstances that would not appear to be the type of circumstances that would get you in a position. Both were kings, and I would say both were put in charge of Pharaoh's house as stewards. So I think that would probably be all the ones they have in common. If you want to comment beyond that and say what it is, I will, it'll be actually here in the chat. So whatever you want to put there. Yes, they both have a connection to Egypt. That's true too. All right. Next one. I think we will probably, yeah, you know what? I think we're going to take a break. I'm going to say maybe in about 15 minutes. So let's see if we can get through this one. I noticed Pharaoh, king of Egypt, being swapped back and forth like Jacob and Israel. I never noticed that before, but it sounds like maybe we have another world and spiritual realm thing going on. What's up with that? Ah, yeah. See, and then here's the beauty of this is in Zohar, I believe it is, or maybe it's in another commentary, but that person was a mystical commentator. So they wouldn't have been one of the more practical rabbis, but one of the more speculative rabbis. Could have potentially been Rashi. Says that Abraham descended into a different realm when he took Sarah down to Egypt, into a different world, as it were. Now, if we look at that from a Kabbalistic perspective, we know that the upper worlds are more about the transcendence of light and energy than they are about the physical and the comfort of a human being. And that's interesting. So the idea of Pharaoh being called king or being called Pharaoh. That's what's interesting about this one is what we probably will need to do is understand the word melech versus the word paro. Now there's two things that are really important here. Number one is that paro is not only an adopted root, but it is a foreign root. Let me explain. In the context of the Hebrew language, there are certain words that are just transliterated over from the actual word in another language, and paro is one of them. I've researched the title paro before, and that's how it's pronounced, paro. It's not pharaoh. So paro in the context of the Hebrew is not necessarily present as a Hebrew word that could be studied or worked out. We could potentially look at the possibility of reading into it by what the pictographs are, but the truth is it's transliteration. So that doesn't necessarily jive unless we look at a deeper, higher picture in that name was not received from earth but from heaven. But Melech we know, right? Melech we know. So it's interesting because Melech doesn't necessarily indicate polarity. Yeah, Melech doesn't necessarily indicate that a person is good or evil. Melech just indicates that they are someone who walks among the people, which is interesting because the concept is that basically they walk among the people as something foreign or esoteric or above them, and yet they walk amongst the people. So it's interesting because once we start to get into that, we start to think about the word king being used here in the Hebrew instead of paro moves him from a foreign entity that we don't know anything about to a Hebrew king. Not necessarily a good one or a bad one, but a Hebrew king. So that's a very interesting concept because then what we get into is we know that when a person hardens their heart, we've already discovered this, we've Midrash this, like before we were ever even on YouTube, our congregation concluded that we were onto something, that a hardening of the heart occurs as a result of fear and a wrong reaction to fear. So as fear begins to come in, we perceive it as anger, not fear, but it's always fear. We perceive it as anger, and we move into this bitter state. And in this bitter state, we say, I'm not going to be affected by this pain. I will harden my heart, and then I won't be affected by this pain. Well, the fear of the pain is what causes you to actually harden your heart. Because the truth is that if you are brave enough to feel the pain and experience the pain and accept that all good things come down, all good gifts come down from the Father of lights, and all things work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose. If we accept those things, then we move into a realm of transcendence of that pain. Not necessarily that we don't feel the pain, but we understand its purpose a little more. And interestingly enough, that diminishes the emotional pain. It may not diminish the physical pain, because you can harden your heart against physical pain. Many cynical, dark, and pessimistic people have physical pain as part of their makeup. So there is that. But the indication of Melech almost indicates that originally, however much he was a shrewd ruler, he didn't move into a state of bitterness until something painful occurred that caused him to hate the Hebrews. And I propose that that might be one of the reasons why he's called king, is because he was willing to walk amongst the people at one point. Share your thoughts if anybody has any thoughts about what I'm saying.
What does that say? It's King of Egypt, right? That's the title, King of Egypt. Melech of Mitzrayim. So it would be the one who walks around among the people that are binded. Because Mitzrayim meaning two bindings, right?
Yeah. It's interesting because that could even lead into some political standpoints in nowadays, where we observe leaders walking in the bitterness of the people and instead of leadership. And that doesn't necessarily have to say that they are right or wrong in their political standpoint, but they operate within the bitterness of the people. Yeah, it's interesting. We see that in the Russian Revolution with Rasputin. Rasputin had an extreme bitterness towards the established governance of Russia. But the result was an absolute upheaval of the entire political system. All right. So yeah, that king definitely seems to indicate something a little bit more transcendent in Hebraic, like almost. See, I've always kind of been given the notion that the word Melech itself, which is just basically one who is mighty, who walks amongst their people, is empathetic. And so there's an intrigue to the idea that it would be a empathy for the bitterness of the people. Which makes sense. Most revolutionaries have empathy of some sort. within their desired outcome.
Mm.
Shifting from the spiritual realm, or shifting from another world in the spiritual realm, it's interesting because in the world, okay, so when we deal with the when we deal with the light of the creator and the diminishing light that occurs in the contractions in order to arrive at a full-blown free will. In other words, we had to diminish the light down to 1% light and 99% darkness for the sake of being able to choose without merit. Because if you want to marry a man because of his money, you're not marrying him for the right reasons. You want to marry a man because of his power, you're not marrying him for the right reasons. You want to marry a man for his energy, you're not marrying him for the right reasons. And so then there's a concept that's why we had to go through the contractions, because arriving at that 1% light and 99% darkness stripped all the benefit away, stripped all of the extra fluff away, and that you just have to choose the creator for the sake of the creator. But within that 1% light and 99% darkness, that 1% light is broken up into 100 pieces, and 99% of that light is concealed. So in this 1% of 1% light is the physical realm. And that particular realm seems to be governed by Pharaoh. And perhaps I'm wrong about this, but then that would put the 99% light realm in the realm of the Melech. And truth be told, it's one of the things I want you guys to think about. You cannot compartmentalize a heart. If you harden your heart, you harden your heart across the board. There's no way to mask the hardening, because your heart doesn't work that way. It doesn't have departments. It doesn't say, oh, well, you know what? I have a son department. I have a father department. I have a coworker department. As a man, if I harden my heart, I harden myself against my coworker, against my son, against my father. It's not that you necessarily lose your love per se of them, but your empathy changes across the board.
Right, and we can definitely see how hardening his heart against the Hebrews and the God of the Hebrews ultimately led to his people suffering as well. So even if he was a malak that walked amongst his people and had empathy for his people, when he hardened his heart against the God of the Hebrews, he hardened his heart against his people as well, because they ended up suffering.
Right. Okay. Well, and the one last thing I want to touch on is that he hardens his heart, and then God hardened his heart. And I wonder if the part where God hardened his heart was not against letting the people go, but against his people, where he stopped being king even to Egypt. It became so much about this celebrity death match between Yahweh and Pharaoh that it no longer was about Egypt anymore. And I've been in that position. I've been in that position where I held on to something, I fought for something, even when it ceased to be about loving that thing, or even when it ceased about being attached to that thing. It was just the principle of holding on to it. I've done that. I've totally done that. Okay, well, we are going to take a break, and then we'll start the second session. And in that second session, we'll go ahead and address some more of these questions. Like I said, I feel like the Rabbi's Nugget was the first part of this. I feel like it needed to be communicated. Guys, we're joining them in the middle of a story. So don't get your heart caught up in some really bad determinism philosophy, or B, that you think you've got it figured out on what was going on with the Israelites. There's a whole story behind it in the cycle of Israel is that story. Because God doesn't change. And the way he dealt with them during the time of the judges, the way he was dealing with them in the way that he was dealing with them in the time when they were in Egypt. So we'll go ahead and say Shabbat Shalom, and we'll end this session, and we will pick back up later on. Shabbat Shalom.